Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to continue to talk about grammar for the IELTS course. Just a reminder there is no actual IELTS grammar section specifically. However, grammar and grammatical range is something that is graded in both the writing and speaking sections. And so, making sure that you have the tools in your toolbox that you need in order to succeed in those sections does involve grammar, and that's why we're going over those grammar conventions today. Today is part 3, and we're going to be learning about modal verbs and subject verb agreement today. So, modal verbs are used to add more information to the main verb to show possibility, ability, regret, or necessity. They are also known as auxiliary verbs or helping verbs because they must be used with the main verb to convey the correct meaning, right? So, some examples would be may, might, can, could, would, should, must, will, or shall, right? In these cases, these verbs can't really be used on their own without some other verb, right? Or another one that isn't in this example but that can be used as a modal verb would be have, right? We can use have or be as a modal verb. That's also a verb that in some cases could be used in a different way, in a non modal way, right? For example, I might say that we have to go to the farm, right? That's different from saying, I have some pants in my drawer, for example, right? So there's some different things that we could say, right? Okay. So the first way that we would use modal verbs is to express a degree of certainty. So if we say Axel will clean up his mess, then that's saying that we're pretty certain. We're pretty certain that Axel's going to clean up his mess, right? If we're unsure or he might not, we're kind of on the fence, we might say Axel may clean up his mess or Axel could clean up his mess. So in this case, we're expressing a degree of less certainty. We're not really sure. It might happen, it might not happen, it could possibly happen, but we aren't entirely sure. Whereas in the first example, when we said Axel will clean up his mess, that's expressing that we're sure this is going to happen. We're pretty certain that he's going to clean up that mess. The second way is to make a suggestion or a demand, right? So let's say that we're a parent and we really, really need Axel to clean up his darn mess, right? We're his parent. We might demand him to and say, Axel, you must clean up your mess. Or, you need to clean up your mess, Axel, right? Actually, this next one, it's this there twice for some reason. You need to clean up your mess. I think one of those is supposed to say, you have to clean up your mess, Axel, right? Because if we're saying that he must, or he needs to, or he has to, right? If we're saying one of those things, we're demanding that he cleans up his mess. We're not making a polite request. We're telling him he has to do it, right? Now, let's say we want to strongly suggest someone do something, but maybe they're not our child, so we don't feel right about giving a strong demand like this, right? It might not be appropriate in all cases to demand that people do things, right? That might be too bossy of us in some cases, right? So we could make a strong suggestion for Axel to clean up his mess in a different case. We might say, you should clean up your mess, Axel, or you ought to clean up your mess, Axel. In this case, we're not demanding him to do it, but we are strongly suggesting that he needs to do it and pushing him in that direction, right? We're not telling him he has to exactly, but we're still kind of coercing him to make him think that that's something that he ought to do, right? Now again, even giving such a strong suggestion may not be appropriate in all cases, right? I'm sure we've all had someone in our life at some point who continually told us what we should do or what we ought to do, and it was annoying as heck, right? So sometimes this is even out of line, right? There's certainly times when people can say that I should do something or I ought to do something, and I feel that no, that's out of bounds. I don't have to do anything. There's, don't tell me what I ought to do or what I should do. I don't have to. Right now, what about a weak suggestion? Right? What if we recognize that maybe a strong suggestion in our scenario doesn't really make sense here, and we're going to make a weak suggestion? Right? Maybe we're not Axel's parent, we're not Axel's boss, we're a coworker of Axel, and we don't feel it's appropriate to, as a coworker, to demand him to clean up his mess. Right? Perhaps that's the job of his boss. right? Or maybe we're the sibling of Axel instead of the parent, right? We could make a weak suggestion and saying, you could clean up your mess, Axel, right? So that's a weak suggestion that he could do it, but we're not really demanding him to do it, and we're also not strongly implying that he should do it, right? We're not enforcing our belief of that onto him in the same way that we were before, right? We're just pointing out that he could clean up his mess potentially, right? That's something he could do, right? So we can use different modal verbs depending on, are we making a polite suggestion, right, or a weak suggestion, or are we demanding him, or is it somewhere in between where we're really strongly implying that's what we want from him, right? What is the most appropriate? And that's going to depend on the scenario, right? If we're the parent and Axel's our child, telling him that he must clean up his mess is pretty reasonable, right? Or if we're his boss, maybe he's our worker and we're the boss, Axel, you must clean up your mess, right? But if we're his coworker and we even say, Axel, you should clean up your mess, he might not be too happy about that, right? That might not really be an appropriate thing, especially if we continue to tell him what he should do and ought to do when we're not in a position of power over him. That could annoy him, right? That could not really be very appropriate, right? So, yeah, so making sure we decide which word makes the most sense in the context is key here, right? The next one is for hypothetical situations, right? For example, if he wants to buy a car, he ought to start saving more of his income, right? Ought to is our modal, and then start is our main verb here. In this case, the main verbs are in red, and the modal verbs are in yellow, right? So we're basically saying a hypothetical of him buying a car that we're saying that in that situation, then he would have to start saving more of his money, is what we're saying essentially. Another example, if we had a better public transportation system, less people would use cars, right? So we're expressing a hypothetical of having that better transportation system and what we think would happen in that hypothetical, which is less people would use cars from our perspective, right? Or another one, I would be happy if you would clean your mess, Axel, right? So clearly he hasn't done it, right? This is a hypothetical expressed by if, right? If you would clean up your mess, Axel. So basically we're saying we'd be happy in this hypothetical situation that Axel decided to clean up his mess, right? So again, we're expressing a hypothetical situation here of that happening and what would happen with us being happy, in the event that he decided to go and do that. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about subject verb agreement basics, right? So, for example, for regular verbs, we have the infinitive version, which is where we have to plus the verb, right? To give, for example. And here's how it works with regular verbs. We just repeat the verb without the to for all of these, except for he, she, or it, we would say gives with an S, right? I give, you give, he gives, she gives, it gives, we give, they give, right? So for first person singular, right? Second person singular or plural, right? Because you could be a singular you or it could be plural. I might be talking to you, as in you are one person. I could be talking to you, as in my whole class of many people. So sometimes people forget that you can be plural. And actually, in some languages like French, they have two different words for you, right? They have a word for singular you, which I think is tu, and they have a word for plural you, which is vous. Although that's not something you have to know. And I mean, there's more exceptions and complications with that rule that I'm not going to get into here as well. But regardless, you in English has two meanings. It could be second person singular or second person plural. So you is sometimes plural, right? He, she, or it, that's third person singular, right? We're talking about a singular person, or in the case of it, a singular object, right? In the third person. We would be first person plural, so we're talking about a group that does include us, ourselves, right? As opposed to they, where we're including a group that doesn't involve ourselves, right? They being a group of people, not including I, right? There's no I in they, right? Whereas I is in we, right? If I say we are going to the movies, I'm including myself, right? If I say they are going to the movies, I'm talking about a group of people that I am not included in, right? So there we go. So there's our basics. Now this is how it works for regular verbs. There's also a whole bunch of irregular verbs. It would be an entire course to go over all of them and how to conjugate them. But definitely make sure you're familiar with your verb conjugation. It's definitely something that's worth reviewing and revisiting if it's something you're not as confident in. I've linked a website here that you can go to get the full list of all irregular verbs, but I will quickly review two common ones that we use. I recommend going over all even relatively common ones before your test day happens. So for example, for to be, we conjugate it this way. I am, you are, he or she is, we are, and they are. Or to have, I have, you have, he or she has, we have, they have. Okay. Then we have there is versus there are, right? There is singular, whereas there are is plural, right? We could say there is a cat, right? That's singular. We just have one cat. We would say they are for plural, right? There are some cats. Or there is a person. Well, that's one person versus there are people, right? People is plural. That's suggesting there's multiple people, right? So that's the difference between there is and there are. It's basically just a singular versus plural thing, and that's all it is, thankfully. Now let's talk about subjects that are separate from the verb, right? So when we conjugate our verbs, sometimes the subject is separate from the verb, but we still must conjugate with respect to the subject, even if the subject and the verb are separate. So, for example, we would say obesity in children is a concern. Now, if you didn't read the sentence closely and you just saw the word children, you might think, well, children's plural. So we should say obesity in children are a concern. But no, children isn't the subject. Obesity is the subject. And so we would say obesity in children is a concern rather than obesity in children are a concern because we're conjugating with respect to our subject obesity, which is singular, not to children, which is plural, even though children is actually closer to right, even though children is technically closer in distance to the verb, right? It doesn't matter. It matters what the subject is. And same with the second one. This one says the new building that the company built are beautiful, right? So we might think, oh, is this wrong, right? The company, that's singular. So would it be is? But no, that's not correct because the subject is what? The subject is the new buildings, right? The phrase that the company built, well, that is telling us which specific new buildings we're talking about, right? This is one of the phrases we talked about earlier, right? It's the relative clause, right? That we talked about earlier in the last lesson, right? And so in this case, this is just giving us extra information, right? Well, partly it's giving us extra information, but it is also essential information. It's being specific about which new buildings we are talking about, right? And so since this is our adverbial clause right here, or sorry, not our adverbial clause, this is our relative clause, my apologies, our relative clause that the company built. The subject is the new buildings, right? That's the subject. And so we're conjugating with respect to the subject. And the new buildings, that is a third person plural, right? We could replace the new buildings with they, right? They are beautiful, right? And so we must use are instead of is. So this is a big thing to keep in mind because this is a really common mistake that I see all the time ever since I started teaching ESL. This is a huge mistake I see people make all the time, right? They look at the word that's closest and they conjugate with respect to that word when you actually must conjugate with respect to the subject. So definitely practice conjugating with respect to the subject, and also just make sure you're doing so not just with your writing, but also with your speaking, right? Practice speaking it more times the correct way to get into the habit, right? Because native English speakers, we don't think about it. We don't think about which one of these is correct to say. We just say it, right? And that's the point I want you guys to get as well. to get to as well, is the point where it's just kind of a habit, right? You just kind of do it. Okay, let's talk about this one. For neither and either, the verb must agree with the noun that's closest to the verb. So, for instance, these two sentences are both correct, even though they're conjugated differently. And all I did was I switched the order of those grapes and that apple. I said neither those grapes nor that apple has mold, right? That apple, right, is what I used because it's closest to the verb to conjugate the has, right? The to have verb. And then here I swapped them around. I put that apple first and those grapes second. I said, neither that apple nor those grapes have mold, right? Because those grapes is plural, so I used have, right? Those grapes could be replaced with they, right? They have mold, conjugates correctly. That apple would be it. It has mold because it's a third person singular object, right? Good. All right, well, that is it for today. I guess that was a shorter one than some of the other days, but today we talked about modal verbs, subject verb agreement, and also just a few common mistakes that I often see that I wanted to point out. So good work today, everyone, and I'll see everyone back for the next day. Bye, everyone.